So let's get started. Welcome, good afternoon, good Wednesday to each of you, Miracles, who have joined us today. I want to especially welcome all of our Stephens community constituents. So welcome to our undergraduate residential students who may be joining in from wherever you are across the country. Welcome to graduate students. Welcome to fully online students. Welcome to our awesome faculty. Welcome to our amazing staff. Welcome to all of our herstory, history, their story, them story making alumni, our alumni. And thank you to our Board of Trustees who might be joining us, and also to our members of our larger COMO, Columbia, Missouri communities. So I welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you for being part of our Stephens community. We are small communities that make up a large community. So welcome to Think, Speak, Do, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. This is webinar 2 of 9. So we are traveling this journey of cultural humility together. I am Shaashawn Dial. I have the pleasure of serving as the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Stephens, a role that I started September 3rd, 2019. I am also a proud alum. I was a philosophy, law, and rhetoric major, business and Spanish minors, and did almost everything that I could do during my 4 years at Stephens, including studying abroad, playing soccer, many other things, the radio station. So it's a pleasure to be back on this soil and doing this work. So I am blessed to be part of what we're branding as equity offices. So though I am an office of one and Shannon Walls is two, we have joined with the fabulous gift of Sadie Mayer Strand as well to be the equity offices of Stephens. And so we all work as partners, collaborators, backup support for each other. And we have an email newsletter that comes out twice a month, that we work on. And more importantly, we are doing the work of what we call the 3 R's of equity. And you'll start to hear a lot more about this. And those 3 R's are rights, responsibilities, and reporting. So we are doing the work to make sure you always know what your rights are when it comes to Title IX, when it comes to ADA, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to make sure you know what your responsibilities are in creating a living, learning, working environment that respects all of our identities so we can bring our whole selves to this place. And also reporting. How do you make a report? Whether you've experienced harassment, discrimination, or whether you've witnessed it. So you'll start to hear a lot more from us about the 3 R's of equity: rights, responsibilities, and reporting. But I thank those awesome colleagues for the amazing work that we're doing. And that is an email address that you can reach any of us, which is equity@stephens.edu. Our purpose, we're developing a common diversity, equity, and inclusion vocabulary for Stephens constituents. And also we are dialoguing to action, and that action is the most important part. So I want to welcome you into this virtual space. We will be community for the next 90 minutes. And so we want to be intentional about that work. So let's go through an exercise of centering, grounding, and breathing. So with centering, I'm going to ask, as you are able, to get comfortable, do your best to uncross any of your limbs that may be crossed. And I want you to just sink into, as much as possible, wherever you are, be that a chair, the floor, your back up against a wall. Maybe you're standing and you're stretching out your spine and giving your muscles an opportunity to breathe. We want to take a pause. It's been a week since we gathered as community. We also want to take this opportunity to just express gratitude for another day, another second, minute, hour, for another opportunity to gather, for an opportunity to learn and grow. We want to give gratitude for the pain and the progress that we are witnessing every single day, and the pain and the progress that is not captured by cell phones or video or main media. It's been an extraordinary month or so, and we want to give room for that. We want to give room for the ability to embrace change and know that we can, and that we continue to navigate a pandemic. So let's go to grounding. I want to encourage you to embrace energy. And one of those ways that we know energy concentrates is through our chakras. And so there's an image there for you. And very quickly, I just want you to focus on those colors. Think about your own body and focus. You've probably answered voicemails, emails, attended some meetings via Zoom, or maybe even face-to-face with a mask. You may have been tending to the mental, physical, spiritual needs of loved ones. That's a lot. And so let's go through these energy chakras. We're going to go from the bottom up, so from the red to the purple. So red is about trust. So take a second and in a positive way, think about energy and light. Think of someone whom you trust and send them red energy and receive any red energy that may come to you. Orange represents creativity. We cannot solve complex problems without creativity in the solutions. Yellow, wisdom and power. We talk a lot about power on the systemic level, and we're also talking about power on the individual influential level. And wisdom, honoring that comes from lived experience and learned experience. How do we weight them the same? How do we weight them differently? Give yourself that yellow light and send out yellow light. The green energy chakra is love and healing. So think of things you love, people you love, and send them green energy. And then also receive and give yourself some of that green energy. Love and healing. The next one is blue. In some diagrams, you'll see it as a very light powder blue. Sometimes it's an indigo blue, it just depends. But that is about communication. So our ability to communicate with others, not just express words, but to receive them, to issue apologies, to issue forgiveness, to stand in our complicated truths, to receive a compliment, to give a compliment, to speak truth to power. So blue is communication. Other diagrams, you may see dark blue or indigo, and that is often awareness. So send that energy out about awareness. That could be new concepts, new vocabulary, connections you make between concepts that you are already familiar with, but increasing our awareness. And last but not least for energy chakras is purple, and that is spirituality. So whenever tradition, whatever energy, force, higher power, and if you do not recognize that, wherever there is a positive light-giving source, tap into it right now. Send it energy and receive energy back from it. So in order to do this work, this anti-racism, social justice work, we need to be mindful of our breathing because it's difficult, it's rich, it's frustrating, it's amazing. And so that means we need to be more conscious because most of us are shallow breathing, myself included. So I'm going to encourage you to take 3 breaths at your own rhythm. You do want to inhale as much as possible and then exhale as well. So go ahead, 3 in your own rhythm. Fantastic job. And as we breathe, we also, again, want to give gratitude to those who have come before us. So we want to give gratitude to our indigenous kin who had this land long before any of us. We want to give positive energy and gratitude to our ancestors, to loved ones who may not be with us, but look over us as energy fields or angels or spirit guides. We want to acknowledge all of those that we've lost in this pandemic and those that who will continue to fight. And we also want to honor all those lives, again, that we know about and those that we don't know about, who have been murdered because of systemic brutality. And we want to give positive energy in whatever color, whatever tradition you're comfortable to their loved ones who remain to grieve and to fight and make a message out of a mess. So let's review. And I know for some of you, you've been with us. So this will be a review, and welcome to our neophytes. So these are community agreements because, again, we're spending time virtually as a community, and it's always good to set community agreements. So we will honor confidentiality in this space. This is a recorded webinar, but we do, thanks to our awesome marketing team, edit the Q&A and the resource sharing later so that no one's personal information or personal stories they may share are out for the world to see. So we will gain permission from a specific person to take anything personal outside of this virtual space. If I hear something and someone shares an identity, and then I run out and go tell 3 other coworkers, oh, well, did you know that this person has this identity? I have violated them, and we don't want that here. However, what is learned here as concepts or vocabulary, we want that to leave. So what is learned here leaves here. And that's a quote by Anissa Ward, who is an amazing facilitator. She's doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work for one of the Penn State University campuses. And she's also known as the founder of the Cupcake Bar. She makes amazing pastries. We're going to practice active listening as much as possible. And we're going to sit in uncomfortability, defensiveness, and awkwardness. That comes up when we're doing this work, whether it's from our implicit bias, whether it's we're still trying to hold on to some social programming that we got from our loved ones or our faith communities or our extended families. We need to be able to let that go. If you don't know, ask, or I should probably modify this and say, if you don't know, Google. And then if you still can't find an answer, ask instead of assume. Ambiverts, keep being our role models, moving in and moving out, whether that's the chat room or the Q&A or when we resource share later and unmute. But keep role modeling for us of when we contribute and then when we encourage someone else to contribute. Extroverts, and remember I'm one, so I'm speaking to myself, we have to self-monitor and encourage introverts to speak because we know extroverts, we like to talk, and we always normally have something that we think is brilliant to say. So we may share again. We do not want to be those people who dominate a conversation, right? On that third time when you get ready to share, I always say nudge, because no violence, but nudge an introvert to speak. That is how we begin to do this allyship work. And introverts, dare to share, don't be selfish. Because introverts, when you are, doing the back and forth pros and cons, you're worried about delivery, you're worried about your word choices. And so you make that decision at the end to say, never mind, I'm not going to share. You rob us of your brilliance. You rob us of an opportunity to make a connection between information or a connection with people. So introverts dare to share, and extroverts share once, maybe even share twice. On that third time, I'm going to need you to be quiet. And remember, I'm speaking to myself. We're going to sit in uncomfortability, defensiveness, and awkwardness again. So let's review. We cannot do this work without social justice framework. These are our beliefs. These are what we know to be true. So racism, like all forms of oppression, is pervasive. It hurts us all, people of color and white people. But it doesn't hurt us in the same way. And because of that, we have different work to do in order to eradicate this. We have intra-community work to do. And then, yes, we have inter-community work as well. Racism is both a system of oppression and a system of advantage based on skin color. All racial prejudice was taught to us, and we can resist that teaching. And if we choose to, we can unlearn it. Might be a little painful, might be a little awkward, but we can do it. By the way, none of us invented racism. It is a legacy that we inherited. We did not create it. However, this is the big comma, we must accept responsibility for our role in its continued existence. So what does the Holocaust, what does slavery, what does the Middle Passage have to do with me? We don't use those type of phrases because we get that we didn't create it. Our grandparents didn't even create it. But our grandparents and our parents and us and our children have inherited it. And so there's a responsibility every day for us to do our best to eradicate it. All prejudices and oppressions are interwoven and entangled. We're going to talk about that today. All of us have had the experience as being the target of oppression, as well as the experience of privilege. As in the words of Bell Hooks, very, very few all perpetrators and all victims. Very rare for it to be that binary. Much more fluidity and complication in that. There is no such thing as a passive anti-racist. So someone in your family, or you being blood family or family of choice, is probably a little passive aggressive, doesn't fly in doing anti-racism work. You can't be a passive anti-racist. You're either actively working against it or you're colluding with it, which means you are allowing it to continue. Individuals, communities, and organizations can and do grow and change, and that is our hope. Our commitment to eliminating racism and all forms of injustice has to be a lifelong one. We are a unique group of people who are signing up for something that doesn't necessarily have a true destination and that we've got to work at every single day. And there's days we're going to jack it up and get it wrong, and there's days that we are going to get it right. And we just have to keep stringing those days together. And difference among humans is not a deficit. Cultural diversity is a gift. So this is a graphic that we use at Stephens. So hopefully it's becoming more and more familiar. Remember, diversity are those individual identities or protected classes when we're thinking about law. It is our sex, our disability, age, race, geography, personality, sexual orientation, faith orientation. It is all those pieces. Equality would say we're just going to treat everyone the same, regardless of their individual or their group attributes. It literally erases differences. And that's why we don't want things in our vocabulary that say, I don't see color, right? Or when folks boil things down and be like, oh, this is just a human issue. Well, what do you mean? Because if we go back, humans are composed of sex, disability, age, race, right? So that's why equality can be painful and problematic. It denies that there is an ongoing impact from the historical isms and phobias, especially through our US system. So we don't say the things like pull yourself up by the bootstraps or even level playing field. Because for anything to be level, we're talking about hundreds of years that we would have to do new acts, right? To just try to equal what was done before. So what are we striving for with those arrows moving to my right is equity. We do want to account for differences in individual and group attributes. We do want to know about the US social institutions and systems, right, that contributed to inequities and disparities. Equity is color conscious. Equity does think about what individuals and groups were excluded and included, and whom had restrictions and who did not have restrictions. It is about access to opportunities, access to resources, and access to outcomes. And it questions patterns of exclusion and discrimination. And what are those US social institutions? Everything that we need to live and to potentially thrive. So government, medicine, finance and banking, religion, media, education, and of course that's K through 12 and higher ed, legal and law enforcement. which of course we're hearing a lot in our national dialogues. And what is exactly the work we have to do? It's a flat image, but it's not flat, right? It is about levels of change, and they're not always very linear. So we're doing individual change. That is what you are doing. That is when you hear a term and you go and Google it. That is when you watch media from a different source. That is when you show up and know you're going to be the small in number somewhere, right? You're going to be the minority in a situation. Communal change, the communities that you're a part of, whether that's athletics, whether that's majors for our students, whether that's your family, blood family, or your family of choices, whether that's faith communities, recreational activities, your volunteerism. How are you a community member who shows up and says in that community, we've got some privileges as a community? Organizational change, that's what this is all about at Stephens. How do we honor this magical ecosystem that we are all a part of, where we are unapologetic about educating women mentally, physically, spiritually, academically, economically, and still recognizing that to criticize it isn't to be disloyal to Stephens. It's to love it enough to want it to be all it can be to all it's supposed to be. And then institutional change, right? So Stephens is situated in the institution of education. How can we be a model, be leaders in the work that we do? Because remember, we're one of only 32, which is amazing. 32 women's colleges left in the country. So what has our summer journey been so far? We had a community conversation Zoom on June 4th. We had a Listening to Change, which was a virtual space for alumni to come and share their stories and the articulation of what they want Stephens to grow into, so how they can be a part of that and what they want to see from Stephens. We will be scheduling more of those throughout the year. We talked about cultural humility and cultural competence last week, so hopefully you did your homework because you're overachievers. And we had a Sirens meeting, which is a group of self-identified alums who've come together and are working with members of the administration to create change and really dialogue to change. So today we're talking about defining isms and the cage of oppression, which is a tool. And as I told you, I think of them as gifts because I know when I received them, being a student as you all are, sitting in facilitated social justice, racial justice workshops and experiences, I was gaining language to go with some lived experiences that I had had. And it broke me wide open, literally, sitting in spaces weeping of like, why didn't I know this information? Why wasn't I taught this in K through 12 or undergrad or my master's or my PhD coursework. And so I share these things with you. So you've seen this one before, racism. And I told you that it was a formula that comes from the United Nations South African delegation around 2000, 2001. So we fill in that blank prejudice plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power. And the answer, racial prejudice, okay? So, and at the bottom, I've given you a graphic that is resistance, right, to that. So if we know racial prejudice plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power is what racism is, then movements like Black Lives Matter grew out of trying to be resistant to racism. So then what would sexism be? If racism was racial prejudice, sexism would be sex prejudice, right? I gotcha. And it's so sex prejudice plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. So that's right. So now you see some of the elements of resistance at the bottom. I put Black Girls Rock or the woman symbol power or girl power. That maroon red-ish symbol is the symbol of intersex. Latinx is the intersection of ethnicity and race and gender, right? So folks who say, I don't fit squarely into the binary of male, female. And then you have the transgender flag and symbol as well. So recognizing that sex, for many of us, I know I received this social programming, was that it was Pepto-Bismol, pink, a girl, or it was sky blue boy. And once that determination was made, that dictated all other expectations moving forward. That was supposed to be what you look like, feminine or masculine, who you were going to partner with or marry, what even careers or professions you should gravitate to. So all of those is sex, prejudice, plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power, showing up in ways like women not getting credit in their own name until the early 70s, right? Which we know that home ownership is a huge part of most portfolios in US economic health and wealth. What about heterosexism? So what prejudice would that be? I'm hearing ya. So sexual orientation prejudice, right? Plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power. So it is prejudice based on if you are not heterosexual, plus the misuse of systemic power. This was at the core of the movement towards marriage equality. Yes, many stories of love and people falling in love were shared, but how did that win happen? What was the cases that went up to the Supreme Court? It was about the power disparity and that heterosexual couples or opposite sex loving couples could go to Vegas and could elope, get engaged, get married, and they would have more rights than a same-sex couple who had been together 20 years. Because without federal marriage equality in most states, that same-sex couple was legally considered to be strangers, which meant you can't pass down a house, you can't pass down estate wealth to someone who's a legal stranger. And so sexual orientation prejudice plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power, i.e. heterosexism, was at the core of that. So what are some of the ways resistance shows up? At the bottom, you have a flag, which is kind of known as the More Color, More Pride flag, and the trans flag that was put together to show, again, the intersections of let's not just talk about being inclusive, let's be about it, right? Folks with multiple compounding layered identities, how do these structures work for them? So what about classism? I know, you all are overachievers. So social class plus prejudice is the misuse of systemic or institutional power, right? So how does that show up in power imbalances, or even how does that show up in pop culture? It shows up to the fact that we'll say poverty and we'll make stereotypes of folks are lazy, folks don't value education or home ownership, or we'll go down that right. At the same time, we'll say the wealthy are sharks. Think of the show Shark Tank, and I love that show. But why are they sharks, right? So think of the metaphors, the things we associate with folks in that way around class. We still use middle class when arguably the last 10, 12 years, there really isn't a middle class, but we still use that. Why? So social class prejudice plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power is, again, talks about access and resources and opportunities. So what is some of the resistance? Well, the graphic in the middle of the two individuals, bartering. Many communities of color, their currencies, their fundamental way of exchanging or having transactions was through bartering. We lost that along the way, right? When capitalism was prioritized. I have the power symbol there, just reminding, Ujamaa is one of the Kwanzaa principles that talks about cooperative economics. So to build and maintain our own stores, shops, and other businesses, and to profit from them together. Many communities of color in this country did that. And they were eradicated by the US social institutions. Literal towns were burned down. People were rushed out of their homes and their communities. And they were doctors and lawyers and barbershops and butchers that were there, and educators for their own community. And absolutely, we can't talk about social class in the US context and not talk about the institution of slavery. And that slave economy absolutely contributes to income inequality And so one of the solutions on the table is reparations. So I don't know how many of you have come across ageism and adultism. Is that familiar to some of you, maybe? So ageism would be what prejudice? Age, yes. So, but that can be elders to the youth. Adultism often specifically means prejudice against young people and youth, plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power. And again, in these movements, don't get paralyzed around, oh, am I using ageism when I should be using adultism? This is about increasing awareness so that we know and we can ask a question later of how they are showing up. So don't get paralyzed around that, because our social movements are moving so fast that some of these concepts have even evolved since this. Where is resistance showing up? I give you some examples at the bottom. So the National Hispanic Council on Aging, the National Indian Council on Aging. There's a Justice and Aging group, which fights senior poverty through law. There is the organization called SAGE, which does advocacy and services specifically for LGBT elders. And I love their tagline, we refuse to be invisible. So there it is again, age prejudice for ageism, and then for adultism, youth or young people, right? Prejudice against them. What about lookism? And some of you might be like, I didn't even know this was a term. It is. And then others of you were like, oh yeah, I know all about that. So lookism would be what prejudice? Appearance prejudice, plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. So another way of thinking about it, whom and what are beauty standards? If I asked you all right now, and I'm assuming none of you work for a high fashion magazine, if I said this is a publication that is prioritizing female readership, or individuals assigned female at birth, or individuals who identify as female, whom probably is on the cover of that? Right, probably someone tall, someone thin. How thin? Like a 0 to a 4, maybe a size 6. Short hair or long hair? Right, most likely long hair, most likely blonde, sometimes brunettes. Right, and most of the time they are white. Where did those beauty standards come from? That's a very Eurocentric model of beauty. That plays into lookism. It also plays into who is marketed to us to sell products. Often it's folks who are considered to be in childbearing age. No wrinkles, so not a really young person, but definitely not an elder or a seasoned individual who's been walking the earth. It's normally right in that childbearing, mid-20s to mid-30s. A piece of that is lookism. If I said there's a publication in my hand and it is prioritized for folks assigned male at birth or folks who identify as male, what does the cover look like on that one? Very similar. They're going to be fit, right? They're most likely going to be showing a 6-pack or an 8-pack. And I don't mean a spirited beverage. I mean, they're going to show you the abs. They're probably oiled down with a whole bunch of shea butter or Vaseline or something. And most likely they are probably in what kind of a stance? Exactly. They're going to be in a power pose, right? So what about my dad bods? What about those who are fuller figured men? When do we see them on the cover of magazines? Is there even a term for full figured men? I just call them full figured. All of that plays into lookism, right? So where is resistance showing up? There's a couple examples at the bottom. Body positivity. Those are around 22 different Instagram accounts that talk about that and highlight around body positivity, having gratitude for your body, that it works in the way that it does. It talks about, it shows full-figured women doing yoga because that's about flexibility. That is about health, not necessarily weight or body mass index, right? So body positivity. I loved the little flower / cactus, right? There's no wrong way to have a body. And that's a message we've been getting out of the disability movement for years, easily since the 60s, early 70s. But have we really internalized that? Does our physical properties mirror that there's no wrong way to have a body? Who do we put in our pamphlets or on our websites? And then there's gender expression. And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but feminine and masculine are the expectations. But there's a whole lot of people walking around who say, I may lean a little more masculine, I may lean more feminine. They could identify as androgynous and say, I feel like I'm really right in the middle. And that can be haircut, that can be voices. I have lived my life with a deeper alto voice my entire life. I have come to love it. It was very traumatic when I was in elementary and middle school. So everything from voice to whether you do makeup or you don't do makeup, your grooming rituals, your clothing, your jewelry selections, all of those work into lookism. And then, of course, as I talked about concepts evolving, right? Anti-Semitism. So what prejudice? Right. So the Jewish religion and or individuals who identify as Jews. Of course, we can expand this, right? It's not solely anti-Semitism. That's that particular one, but we could very well talk about Islamophobia, which would still be Islamic religion or Muslims, prejudice against the religion or prejudice against individuals who identify as Muslims, plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. We could substitute Hindus. We can substitute atheists and agnostics as well, and say that a prejudice against this group of people or their faith or their no faith fits into this. So really the broader umbrella could be religion, but you'll see why I specifically put anti-Semitism on this slide. And I've mentioned them already, a movement that I continue to learn from so much, but ableism. So when we keep talking about isms and phobias, hopefully this information is helping you to be able to break that down and not just say, I don't even know what they're talking about. Kind of like systemic racism. Now we know, we can define it. You can now define these isms. So what's the prejudice of ableism? Who or what? Exactly. The physical is obvious, but I always say it's important that we expand and grow. So that would also be cognitive. That could be linguistic, that could be behavioral, right? So obviously physical prejudice. So folks who navigate the world differently, whether that's a wheelchair, crutches, a walker, a cane, okay? Cognitive, right? That is our different learning styles. There's a whole spectrum, right? It could be those with brain injuries. Linguistic, what about stutters? Right? What about, I don't know how many of you, I did 2 full years in elementary school of speech class because I could not pronounce S's and H's, CH's with a name like Shaashawn. Trauma, right? So I was excused and went down the hall and went to that class so I could pronounce those. So if they had not had that particular positive intervention in my Department of Defense, elementary school, then I'd be navigating life with those. And that could harm me in certain places and not harm me in other places. And of course, behavioral, many folks interpret this as our individuals who are experiencing or navigate the world with autism and our other different classifications of pieces, right? So Ableism, physical, cognitive, linguistic, and behavioral prejudice, plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. So what's the resistance? The one right in the middle is their own slogan from the disabilities movement. Nothing about us without us. They made that clear. You're not going to go to the table and talk about folks with disabilities if you don't have folks with disabilities at the table. You will prioritize our lived experience, whether we have credentials or not, or bringing people to the table who are folks who are highly credentialed and navigate the world with disabilities, and folks who don't have credentials and are navigating the world with disabilities and bringing that. Another form of resistance is universal design, making design accessible to everyone in society. When we do that, multiple groups always benefit. I remember being so frustrated and crying so often when I would see, when North Carolina, because remember I spent 20 years on the East Coast, when North Carolina did the bathroom bills. And it was all of the hate-fueled, lie-fueled, myth-fueled information around these folks just want special rights, or they just want bathrooms to themselves so they can go do allegedly harmful things. The part that normally didn't hit the dominant narrative at that time was that single stall bathrooms does not just benefit individuals who identify as transgender. Single stall bathrooms help people navigating with a stroller, a walker, a wheelchair, a cane, because they give you more physical space between where the sink and the toilet. Many of them have bars where you can steady your balance. So it wasn't just transgender people fighting for something that benefited themselves, that would benefit many groups. And that is always the case with universal design. It helped seniors who navigate and need more space or time. It helps folks who can't do something solo. Think about trying to squeeze 2 people in a stall. I rock for the full figured ones, and I can barely get into some stalls on different physical places. So if I needed to have another human being with me, if I needed to have my guide animal with me, then a single stall would benefit me. But that is a choice to get into that mindset, to know that when we're fighting the isms and we're fighting phobias, we cannot just look at a singular group and say, oh, they just want special rights, or they're just asking so much from us. Because the way oppression is layered, there are always multiple people who are going to benefit if we center their voices and their lived experience. So those are the rough. I mean, there's many. There's a plethora of phobias. There's a plethora of other isms. Those are some of the core ones, and you'll see why those were selected. So I love this graphic. Oppression equals unjust use of power. So, right, that's the misuse of power in our formula, to enforce an unequal relationship and deny another's rights or value. So oppression is unjust use of power to enforce an unequal relationship and deny another's rights or value. And I love this quote: systemic racism doesn't simply rear its ugly head. That's another one of those very individualistic phrases. Systemic racism is voted on. It's enacted with policies through our social institutions, and it is used to disenfranchise. So this is a tool, and it's called the cage of oppression. So you can look at it as a bird cage or any other type of structure. And it was created by Jonah Olson, an amazing anti-racist social justice advocate. I've had the pleasure in sitting in 3 of her different workshops and classes, and she's phenomenal. And she helped found an organization called Cultural Bridges to Justice. So this is a tool that she created. So I want you to look at it. So some of those isms should look familiar, and you can read it from right to left or left to right, whatever your comfortability is, and you'll see ableism. heterosexism, anti-Semitism, lookism. There's open spaces. We could easily put Eurocentrism in there, right? Meaning the prejudice against anything that isn't from a Eurocentric foundation. Ageism and adultism, classism, sexism, racism. We could create more cages, and we could do Islamophobia. We could do transphobia. We could keep going, okay? And I'm going to email this out after this session so that you can actually do this exercise with yourself and colleagues and loved ones. So what I want you to do is look across. I'm going to take my little pointer. Hopefully you can see it. And you'll see this horizontal line that goes across the cage. Okay, and I want you to look at that as dividing between this space and this space in this particular bar of ableism. Okay, and I want you to think of this as a very clear demarcation line. So under ableism, I want you to think about who is dominant. So if we know that ableism is prejudice based on physical, cognitive, linguistic, or behavioral ability, who becomes the dominant group here? Who are streets and curbs built for? Who are elevators and stairs built for? Who are dominant learning models built for? Exactly. So we could put in here able-bodied, right? We could put in here dominant ways of processing information. We could put in here those who do not have some type of cognitive injury. Exactly. So who would be down here? Right, those who navigate the world with a disability. So let's go here. What about heterosexism? Who would be the dominant? And I'm using that word for a reason. We're going to expand on it. But who would be the dominant? Right. So opposite sex loving people. Folks with the opportunity to marry prior to 2015 federally. Yes. Oh, I love it. Very good. So those perceived to be heterosexual. That's huge. Right. So then who's down here? Yep. Same sex loving couples. All right. It could also be some of those other identities that make their way into, I call it the rainbow alphabet, right? So it could be in heterosexism, there's a presumption of monogamy. So those who might be in a polyamorous relationship or a polygamous relationship, those are two different things, both P's, but very different. Right, they would be down here, right? So really anything that isn't an opposite sex monogamous relationship would be down here. Anti-Semitism. So who would we put here? So another way to think about it is down here is who is the prejudice against, who's doing the stereotyping and the bias up here. Right, so often in the US context, this is Christian, right? This is very much foundations around that. And down here would be those of the Jewish faith. And remember, that can be ethnicity, that can be people, that can be the religion and the perception of. So lookism, we talked about being appearance prejudice, plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. So up here for lookism, right, there's a little crossover here between ableism, because lookism often can be those who are perceived or are able-bodied. It's often going to be very Eurocentric beauty standards. It's going to be certain size, weight, height, hair length, assumptions of fitness. Lookism is also going to be in hair, right? So a couple months ago, this year, New York passed a law that said you cannot fire someone based on their hair. And that law was specifically done to protect communities of color, and specifically African Americans or Black folks who wear locks. Because our neighbor in Illinois has a law that's the exact opposite. And their state Supreme Court passed a law that said you can deny someone employment based on hair. That ruling said because the hair can be changed. The New York one said that is ridiculous. You know, everyone cannot grow locks. There's a lot of people who try, but most people cannot grow locks. And so they wanted to make sure that it was in law that organizations could not use the power, misuse their systemic power to force people into looking a certain way. Because when you do that, you dominate the Eurocentric, because locks aren't grown in Europe, okay? So up here, so down here, we know that. This is often people of color. This is cultural representations. Why is this important? This shows up in an organization in the dress code. What happens if I identify truly with my African heritage and I wanted to come to work and in African garb? Is that okay in our culture? Because suited and booted, a gray, black, sometimes brown, pinstripe suit is a very Eurocentric defined definition of what is business. What's business casual? What's formal? What's cocktail attire? Those all are Eurocentric pieces, because if you go to other cultures, it might be in the fabric. It could be in the type of kente that's used during the day or at night. It could be a 3 or 6 piece garment. So that's why lookism becomes important. What about ageism and adultism? So again, we're talking about who's favored, who's not. Ageism. I kind of gave you a hint when we talked about the slide. So often who is dominant is childbearing, what we think is youth, but not too youthful, right? We think of maturity. We think of folks who have the money to spend on haircuts and makeup and pieces like that. So who is not often favored? Our seasoned folks, our elderly, our ancestors. And how does that show up? It can show up in different ways. It shows up in Hollywood that arguably after 40, 45, very difficult for females to get work, or they're typecast in a very specific role. Somebody's grandma, something like that, right? Adultism. So again, our youth. Are they able to make decisions for themselves? Is that how our US social institutions look at youth? Classism. Right. So the dominant would be the wealthy. Another way to look at it, though, is not just wealth, it would be ownership. So whom owns? Because we know ownership is the blueprint to wealth. And often if you have multiple streams of revenue, multiple streams of income. I learned it as if you can making money in your sleep. Now you've got multiple streams of income coming in, that puts you closer. They say for the average millionaire, they have 7 streams of income. Normally, to be able to have 7 streams of income, you're owning something or multiple somethings. So ownership class would be here. And then in here, right, we could put poverty, we could arguably put middle class. And the challenge with classism is that it's complicated, right? Because how could we dare make assumptions or stereotypes about folks in poverty, but then we know that what is considered the current wage is not a living wage? I am not good in math, but I know that $8, $9, $10, when I do that times 40 hours a week, it's not going to be enough to pay for an apartment and for transportation, let alone, groceries. Maybe you're taking care of aging parents, taking care of children. I mean, daycare is a car note in itself. So this is where all this becomes really complicated. Sexism, who is dominant? Yes, men, right. Who are the laws? Who are the social institutions set up for? Men, right? Which would mean women. But as we're growing in our awareness, we know that this can also be non-binary people, right? So anyone who is not male or perceived as male would be here. And then we've got racism. Pretty simple, pretty binary. The dominant would be white folks and, right, people of color. Knowing that that's different groups, right? Black, African, Caribbean, Indigenous, Hispanic and Latinx, Middle Eastern diaspora, Asian Pacific Islander, Hawaiian Native, biracial, multiracial. So this is the cage of oppression. And it becomes important because now, because I'm dealing with a lot of scholars and we're in academia, let's use synonyms because many of us are tuned out to dominant. We're tuned out to the majority minority, and some of us don't even use those words in our vocabulary. So let's go back through. When I talked about the dominant, I want you to close your eyes right now, and I want you to think through these. Ableism. Who is seen? Who is favored? Who is celebrated? Who is given first, second, third chances? Who is not harshly disciplined as much? That is where these isms and phobias show up. Because we can get caught up in dominant, but when we start asking those other layered questions of who's favored, who's seen, who's prioritized, who's marketed to, then that means this tells us who is invisible, who is not celebrated, who is not given second and third chances. I always say the example in this one, who's pulled behind closed doors and have a talking to or have things poured into them? Who's groomed? Who is not groomed? So same thing here. Who is seen, favored, celebrated? The other way to think about it also is who clearly has the rights and who doesn't. So wherever you fall on the marriage equality spectrum, you couldn't deny the fact that you would have to explain why it's okay for certain groups of people to be able to pass on their pensions and property rights and have adoption rights of children and name changes, and then another group isn't. The power is who was able to make those laws and those rules. And most of the time it's completely arbitrary, right? It's off of prejudice. I don't like those gays. I don't like those people of color. I think something must be wrong with people who have a disability. And that prejudice, that belief that a group is inferior or superior plays out in our cage of oppression, right? So again, look at who's favored, who's not. Well, that falls into who do we see? Representation. Who do we see as TV anchors? Who gets the movie leads? What's the dominant narrative? What do characters look like? To me, I always go back to the canon. I was a great AP student in high school. I also was quite bitter that I was consistently reading old, drunk, often dead white men. I had to do work outside of the educational institution to come and fall in love with writers of color, specifically Black writers. Why? Why did most of us not know about Hidden Figures until the movie came out, including the actors of the movie themselves who initial thought that it was a work of fiction? But most of us, whether you were homeschooled or cyber school or you physically reported to school, know that we had science class, that we saw the NASA launches on some little TV, be it black and white or color, somewhere. Why? Because of isms and because of racism. It was a strategic decision by those in power to make sure that I, as a little Black girl, could not know that there was this whole group of women known as colored computers who were doing elaborate mathematical equations by hand. Because then too, maybe I would have looked and said, oh, I can be in STEM. I want to be like them. I can do that. So this is where this shows up, and this is our work. So this isn't just exposure of the cage of oppression. So now you can say, oh, I saw this tool called the cage of oppression. When we get this visual and this tool, this now helps us figure out where is it showing up. So this is a completed one. And again, this is, Jonah created this like in 85, 86-ish. So that's why it continues to evolve as concepts do. But this is the work that you just did with me. So if you look and we talk about sex, right? Men were favored, you see where women are. Race, whites favored, people of color not. Owning class, right? Socioeconomic, everyone else. Ability, people with able bodies, people with physical disabilities. And of course, we've extended that. You know, sexual orientation, people who are perceived as heterosexual, that's always important. People who are perceived or are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and this one's transsexual. So look at how quickly, right, the language evolves. And even here again, religion, Christianity, people of all other religions. So this is a fabric of oppression and impacted groups. And why does that matter? Because it's the root causes of power imbalances. This is what has caused the inequities and the disparities. It is not the groups themselves. And for me, that was a gift, because if you listen to dominant narratives, they'll say, well, it's women's problems. When they go and have a child and they leave the workforce, that's their fault that they're going out for 5, 10, or 15 years, not recognizing that that decision is impacted essentially by this bar. It is impacted by whether or not they have paid maternity leave. It is impacted of whether there's paternity leave or the other spouse or parent can take time. Right? If we put it all on people of color, they are responsible for the disparities or the inequities that they experience, then we let everybody off the hook for all of the historical exclusions and discrimination that was put upon this group. Same thing, owning class, same thing, people with disabilities. How is it people with disabilities' fault that there were not curb cuts? And that they had to start a movement in order to get curb cuts so that they could navigate through cities, up and down curbs across the street. How is that their fault? It's not. It's the privilege that comes from up here, that the sidewalk was built for able-bodied people, that elevators, what stops in a fire? Elevators. So how does a non-able-bodied person get to the first floor? If the elevator shuts down, that means they're dependent on another person to help them get down the stairwells. That is privilege. That's not the person with disabilities' fault. Sexual orientation and religion. So I don't know about you, but I found this to be extremely impactful in trying to demonstrate the layers. So what are the examples of how, for instance, Black people are affected by racism. So we're going through an oppression lens right now. So the destruction of Black communities. So as I told you, that was the US government that sanctioned, right, places like Black Wall Street to be completely burned down. Restricted education. Had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get Brown versus the Board of Education. The dominant narrative is that that was all good and it was wonderful because it was for integration. The narrative that was not shared is that that immediately put the 40,000 or so Black educators out of jobs immediately when we integrated, because we had been in our own Black schools. So we had our own Black educators and administrators and principals. They weren't allowed to just go and start working at the white schools. So they were immediately put out of work. But we don't share that narrative because we don't want to complicate the narrative. We just want to say Brown versus Board of Education was amazing and it did integration. But we had already had years then of unequal textbooks, unequal investment of resources in these schools. What schools had air conditioning, which ones didn't? Negative media influences. I don't know about you, but I can't watch the local news every single day. It is depressing because they lead with any shootings, killings, robbings, stabbings. And often if it's a person of color, the face in the mugshot is put right up there. Why, as an industry, doesn't media lead with the feel-good story? Sandwich it. Lead with the good one, put the tragedies and the harshness in the middle, and then end with something else. That's the US social institution of media. But we get negative media influences. Think of the roles that people could play: the athlete, the entertainer. I have a weekly call with my brother, who's an Air Force pilot. He's one of the 250 Black pilots in the entire Air Force, which is something between 2,000 and 3,000 pilots. And he asked, he said he often uses a question for people. He says, especially for white people, so this will be a piece of your homework, is quickly name 10 Blacks or African Americans who are household names who are not athletes or entertainers. It's part of your homework. If you struggle with that, and I don't want to know, but if you struggle with that, that is an aha moment. That is some defensiveness, awkwardness I want you to work through. Because for so much, the only media influences representation is athletes and entertainers. And the white dominant culture doesn't have to go know who are other people who might be household names for us in the Black community. Microaggressions, and we talk about that. We're going to have the phenomenal Sarah Crosby, who is an alum and also serves on our board of trustees. We're going to co-facilitate on allyship and privilege, and we're going to talk about microaggressions, those little bitty cuts that add up. Now, this is an individual and a community dealing with all of this at the same time. Increased poverty, attack on Black families, mass incarceration, limited knowledge of Black history and culture. So that's kind of like my Hidden Figures example. Drug infiltration. If you haven't Googled or watched some documentaries about how drugs were specifically infiltrated and put into urban centers, then you're probably carrying some implicit bias that you think, oh no, Black folks or Black and brown folks just gravitate towards drugs. Look at the way that they've been handled differently. In the 80s, it was a completely individual sentence. These people don't care about families' lives, they're addicts, right? The example of like the crack addict. It's articulated in such different ways through our US social institutions now when we talk about the opioid crisis. Race is the difference between how those two were handled, and socioeconomic status. Restricted healthcare. Remember, we had to go use hospitals that were not made for us or by us. So we were the recipients of things like the Tuskegee experiment, the sterilization of Black and brown women, specifically Mexican American women, restrictions on Black businesses. Who has the direct line to the bank? Who can even get approved for a business loan or their startup capital for their business? Police brutality, we've been living through it, and we're living through a revolution now. Internalized psychological oppression, increased trauma, persecution of Black leaders, shortened life expectancy, population control, and then many other factors. This is oppression. The misuse of power through our US social institutions. So this is one of my favorite phrases. It is not if isms and phobias are operating, it is where and to what extent. So where and what extent are they operating at Stephens? I know, let's embrace the uncomfortability and the awkwardness, but this is our work. This is how we gain a concept, and then we open it through our lenses to say, how can we make it better? So how are those isms and phobias showing up at Stephens?